velocity upon the horizon behind her back lighted the ridge towards which her face was set. The barrier of the veil, wherein she had of late been a stranger, which she would have to climb over to reach her birthplace. The ascent was gradual on this side, and the soil and scenery differed much from those within Blackmore Vale. Even the character and accent of the two peoples had shades of difference, despite the amalgamating effects of a roundabout railway, so that, though less than 20 miles from the place of her sojourn at Tentridge, her native village had seemed a far-away spot. The field folk shut in there traded northward and westward, travelled, courted, and married northward and westward, thought northward and westward. Those on this side mainly directed their energies and attention to the east and south. The incline was the same down which d'Urberville had driven with her so wildly on that day in June. Tess went up the remainder of its length without stopping, and, on reaching the edge of the escarpment, gazed over the familiar green world beyond, now half veiled in mist. It was always beautiful from here. It was terribly beautiful to Tess today, for, since her eyes last fell upon it, she had learned that the serpent hisses where the sweet bird sings. Life was totally changed for her forthwith. Verily, another girl than the one she had been at home was she, who, bowed by the thought, stood still here and turned to look behind her. She could not bear to look forward into the vale. Ascending by the long, wide road that Tess herself had just laboured up, she saw a two-wheeled vehicle, beside which walked a man who held up his hand to attract her attention. She obeyed the signal to wait for him with unspeculative repose, and in a few minutes man and horse stopped beside her. "Why did you slip away by stealth like this?" said d'Urberville, with upbraiding breathlessness. "On a Sunday morning, too, when people were all in bed. I only discovered it by accident, and I have been driving like the deuce to overtake you. Just look at the mare. Why go off like this? You know that nobody wished to hinder your going, and how unnecessary it has been for you to toil along by foot, and encumber yourself with this heavy load. I have followed like a madman, simply to drive you the rest of the distance, if you won't come back." "I shan't come back," said she. "I thought you wouldn't. I said so. Well, then, put up your baskets, and let me help you on." She listlessly placed her basket and bundle within the dog cart, and stepped up, and they sat side by side. She had no fear of him now, and in the cause of her confidence her sorrow lay. D'Urberville mechanically lit a cigarette, and the journey was continued, with broken, unemotional conversation on the commonplace objects by the wayside. He had quite forgotten his struggle to kiss her, when, in the early summer, they had driven in the opposite direction, along the same road. She sat now, like a puppet, replying to his remarks in monosyllables. After a space, they came in view of the clump of trees beyond which the village of Marlow stood. It was only then that her still face showed the least emotion, a tear or two beginning to trickle down. "What are you crying for?" he coldly asked. "I was only thinking that I was born over there," murmured Tess. "Well, we must all be born somewhere. I wish I'd never been born there or anywhere else. Pooh. Well, if you didn't wish to come to Tentridge, why did you come?" She did not reply. "You awoke in her. My God, I could knock you out of the gig. Did it never strike your mind that what every woman says, some women feel? Very well, he said, laughing. I am sorry to wound you. I did wrong. I admit it. He dropped into some little bitterness as he continued. Only, you needn't be so everlastingly flinging it in my face. I am ready to pay to the uttermost farthing. You know you need not work in the fields or the dairies again. You know you may clothe yourself with the best, instead of in the bald plain, where you have lately affected, as if you couldn't get a ribbon more than you earn. Her lip lifted slightly, though there was little scorn, as a rule, in her large and impulsive nature. I have said I will not take anything more from you, and I will not. I cannot. I should be your creature to go on doing that, and I won't. One would think you were a princess from your manner, in addition to a true and original d'Urberville. Well, Tess dear, I can say no more. I suppose I am a bad fellow, and a damn bad fellow. I was born bad, and I have lived bad, and I shall die bad in all probability. But, upon my lost soul, I won't be bad towards you again, Tess. And, if certain circumstances should arise, you understand, in which you are in the least need, the least difficulty, send me one line, and you shall have, by return, whatever you require. I may not be a tenth rich. I'm going to London for a time. I can't stand the old woman, but all letters will be forwarded. She said that she did not wish him to drive her farther, and they stopped just under the clump of trees. d'Urberville alighted and lifted her down bodily in his arms, afterwards placing her articles on the ground beside her. She bowed to him slightly, her eye just lingering on his, and then she turned to take the parcels for departure. Alec d'Urberville removed his cigar, bent toward her, and said, You're not going to turn away like that, dear. Come. If you wish, she answered indifferently. See how you've mastered me. She thereupon turned round and lifted her face to his, and remained like a marble term while he imprinted a kiss upon her cheek, half perfunctorily, half as if zest had not yet quite died out. Her eyes vaguely rested upon the remotest trees in the lane while the kiss was given, as though she were nearly unconscious of what he did. Now the other side, for old acquaintance' sake. She turned her head in the same passive way as one might turn at the request of a sketcher or hairdresser, and he kissed the other side, his lips touching cheeks that were damp and smoothly chill as the skin of the mushrooms growing round them. You don't give me your mouth and kiss me back. You never willingly do that. You'll never love me, I fear. I have said so often. It is true. I have never really, truly loved you, and I think I never can, she added mournfully. Perhaps, of all things, a lie on this thing would do the most good to me now, but I have honour enough left, little as 'tis, not to tell that lie. If I did love you, I may have the best of causes for letting you know it, but I don't. He emitted a laboured breath, as if the scene were getting rather oppressive to his heart, or to his conscience, or to his gentiality. Well, you are absurdly melancholy, Tess. I have no reason for flattering you now, and I can say plainly that you need not be so sad. You can hold your own for beauty against any woman of these parts, gentle or simple. I say it to you as a practical man and a well-wisher. If you are wise, you will show it to the world more than you do before it fades. And yet, Tess, will you come back to me? Upon my soul, some sort, and carried a tin pot of red paint in his hand. He asked, in a businesslike manner, if he should take her basket, which she permitted him to do, walking beside him. "It is early to be astir this Sabbath morn," he said cheerfully. "Yes," said Tess, "when most people are at rest from their week's work." She also assented to this. "Though I do more real work today than all the week besides." "Do you?" "All the week I work for the glory of man, and on Sunday for the glory of God. That's more real than the other, eh? I have a little to do here at this stile." The man turned as he spoke to an opening at the roadside leading into a pasture. "If you'll wait a moment," he added, "I shall not be long." As he had her basket, she could not well do otherwise, and she waited, observing him. He set down her basket and the tin pot, and, stirring the paint with the brush that was in it, began painting large square letters on the middle board of the three composing the style, placing a comma between each word, as if to give pause, while that word was driven well home to the reader's heart. "Thy damnation slumbereth not." 2 Peter 2:3. Against the peaceful landscape, the pale, decaying tints of the copses in the blue horizon and the Lycian starboards, these staring, vermilion words shone forth. They seemed to shout themselves out and make the atmosphere ring. Some people may have cried, "Alas, poor theology," at the hideous defacement, the last grotesque face of a creed which had served mankind well in its time. But the words entered Tess with an accusatory horror. It was as if this man had known her recent history, yet he was a total stranger. Having finished his text, he picked up her basket, and she mechanically resumed her walk beside him. "Do you believe what you paint?" she asked, in low tones. "Believe that text? Do I believe in my own existence?" "But," she said tremulously, "suppose your sin was not of your own seeking?" He shook his head. "I cannot split hairs on that burning query," he said. "I have walked hundreds of miles during this past summer, painted these texts on every wall, gate, and stile in the length and breadth of this district. I leave their application to the hearts of the people who read them." "I think they are horrible," said Tess. "Crushing, killing." "That's what they're meant to be," he replied in a trade voice. "But you should read my hottest one. I gips for slums and seaports. They'd make you wriggle. Not but what this is a very good text for the rural districts. Ah, there's a nice bit of blank wall up by that bar, standing to waste. I must put one there. Will you wait, miss?" "No," said she, and, taking her basket, Tess trudged on. A little way forward, she turned her head. The old grey wall began to advertise a similar fiery lettering to the first, with a strange and unwanted mine, as if distressed at duties it had never before been called upon to perform. It was with a sudden flush that she read and realized what was to be the inscription. He was now halfway through. "Thou shalt not commit." Her cheerful friend saw her looking, stopped his brush, and shouted, "If you want to ask anything of the sort we was talking about, there's a very earnest, good man going to preach a charity sermon today in the parish you are going to. Mr. Clare, of a minister. I'm not of his persuasion now, but he's a good man, and he'll explain as well as any parson I know. 'Twas he began the work in me." But Tess did not answer. She throbbingly resumed her walk, her eyes fixed on the ground. not going him to marry ye, reiterated her mother. Any woman would have done it but you. Perhaps any woman would, except me. It would have been something like a story to come back with if you had, continued Mrs. Durbeyfield, ready to burst into tears of vexation. After all the talk about you and him, which has reached us here, who would have expected it to end like this? Why didn't you think of doing some good for your family instead of thinking only of yourself? See how I've come to thieve and slave, and your poor weak father with his heart clogged like a dripping pan. I did hope for something to come out of this, to see what a pretty pair you and he made that day when you drove away together 4 months ago. See what he has given us. All as we thought, because we were his kin. But if he's not, it must have been done because of his love for me, and yet you've not got him to marry. Get Alec d'Urberville in the mind to marry her. He marry her. On matrimony he never once said a word. And what if he had? How she might have been impelled to answer him by a crude snatching at social salvation, she could not say. But her poor, foolish mother little knew her feeling towards this man. Perhaps it was unusual in the circumstances, unnatural, unaccountable, but there it was, and this, as she had said, was what made her detest herself. She had never cared for him. She did not care for him now. She had dreaded him, winced before him, succumbed to him, and that was all. Hate him she did not quite, but he was dust and ashes to her, and even for her namesake she scarcely wished to marry him. You ought to have been more careful if you didn't mean to get him to make you his wife. Oh, mother, my mother, cried the agonized girl, turning passionately upon her parent as if her whole poor heart would break. How could I be expected to know? I was a child when I left this house 4 months ago. Why didn't you tell me there was danger? Why didn't you warn me? Ladies know what to guard against, because they read novels that tell them of these tricks. But I never had the chance of discovering in that way, and you did not help me. Her mother was subdued. I thought if I spoke of his fond feelings, and what they might lead to, you would dislike him and lose your chance, she murmured, wiping her eyes with her apron. Well, we must make the best of it, I suppose. 'Tis nature, after all, and what pleases God. Chapter 14. The event of Tess Durbeyfield's return from the house of her rich kinsfolk was rumoured abroad, if rumour be not too large a word for a space of a square mile. In the afternoon, several young girls of Marlow, former schoolfellows and acquaintances of Tess, called to see her arriving, dressed in their best, starched and ironed, as became visitors to a person who made a transcendent conquest, as they supposed, and sat round the room, looking at her with great curiosity. For the fact that it was this said 31st cousin, Mr. Durbeyfield, who had fallen in love with her, a gentleman not altogether local, whose reputation as a reckless, gallant, and heartbreaker was beginning to spread beyond the immediate boundaries of Tantridge, lent Tess's supposed position, by its fearsomeness, a far higher fascination than it would have exercised if unhazardous. Their interest was so deep that the younger ones whispered when her back was turned, "How pretty she is, and how that best frock too set her off. I believe it cost an immense deal, and that it was a gift from him." Tess, who was reaching up to get the tea things from the corner cupboard, did not hear these commentaries. If she had heard them, she might soon have set her friends right on the matter. But her mother heard, and Joan's simple vanity, having been denied in the hope of a dashing marriage, bet itself as well as it could upon the sensation of a dashing flirtation. Upon the whole, she felt spasmodic weakness. The ghastliness of her momentary pride would convict her and recall her to reserved listlessness again, and the despondency of the next morning's dawn, when it was no longer Sunday, but Monday, and no best clothes, and the laughing visitors were gone, and she awoke alone in her old bed, the innocent younger children breathing softly around her, in place of the excitement of her return, and the interest it had inspired. She saw before her a long and stony highway, which she had to tread without aid, and with little sympathy. Her depression was then terrible, and she could have hidden herself in a tomb. In the course of a few weeks, Tess revived sufficiently to show herself so far as was necessary to get to church one Sunday morning. She liked to hear the chanting, such as it was, and the old psalms, and to join in the morning hymn. That innate love of melody, which she had inherited from her ballad-singing mother, gave the simplest music a power over her which could well nigh drag her heart out of her bosom at times. To be as much out of observation as possible, for reasons of her own, and to escape the gallantries of the young men, she set out before the chiming began, and took a back seat under the gallery, close to the lumber, where only old men and women came, and where the bier stood on end among the churchyard tools. Parishioners dropped in by twos and threes, deposited themselves in rows before her, rested 3/4 of a minute on their foreheads, as if they were praying, though they were not, then sat up and looked around, when the chance came on when one of her favourites happened to be chosen among the rest, the double chant Langdon, but she did not know what it was called, though she would have much liked to know, she thought, without exactly wording the thought, how strange and godlike was the composer's power, who, from the grave, could lead through sequences of emotion which he alone had felt at first, a girl like her, who had never heard of his name, and never would have a clue to his personality. The people who had turned their heads turned them again as the service proceeded, and at last, observing her, they whispered to each other. She knew what their whispers were about, grew sick at her heart, and felt that she could come to church no more. The bedroom which she shared with some of the children formed her retreat more continually than ever. Here, under her few square yards of thatch, she watched winds and snows and rains, gorgeous sunsets and successive moons at their fall, so close kept, she, that at length almost everybody thought she had gone away. The only exercise the Tess took at this time was after dark, and it was then, when out in the woods, that she seemed least solitary. She knew how to hit to a hair's breadth that moment of evening when the light and the darkness are so evenly balanced that the constraint of the day and the suspense of night neutralize each other, leaving absolute mental liberty. It is then that the plight of being alive becomes attenuated to its least possible dimensions. She had no fear of the shadows. Her sole idea seemed to be to shun mankind, or rather that cold execration called the world, which, so terrible in the mass, is so unformidable, even pitiable in its units. On these lonely hills and dales, her quiescent glide was of a piece with the element she moved in. Her flexuous and stealthy figure became an integral part of the scene. At times, her whimsical fancy would intensify natural processes around her till they seemed a part of her own story. Rather, they became a part of it, for the world is only a psychological phenomenon, and what they seemed they were. The midnight airs and gusts, moaning amongst the tightly wrapped buds and bark of the winter twigs, were formulae of bitter reproach. sleeping birds in the hedges, watching the skipping rabbits on a moonlit watering, or standing under a pheasant-laden bough. She looked upon herself as a figure of guilt intruding into the haunts of innocence. But all the while, she was making a distinction where there was no difference. Feeling herself in antagonism, she was quite in accord. She had been made to break a necessary social law, but no law known to the environment in which she fancied herself such an anomaly. Chapter 14. It was a hazy sunrise in August. The denser nocturnal vapours, attacked by the warm beams, were dividing and stringing into isolated fleeces within hollows and coverts, where they waited till they should be dried away to nothing. The sun, on account of the mist, had a curious, sentient, personal look, demanding the masculine pronoun for its adequate expression. His present aspect, coupled with the lack of all human forms in the scene, explained the old-time Eliorites in a moment. One could feel that a saner religion had never prevailed under the sky. The luminary was a golden-haired, beaming-faced, mild-eyed, godlike creature, gazing down on the vigour and intentness of youth upon an earth that was brimming with interest for him. His light, a little later, broke through chinks of cottage shutters, throwing stripes like red hot pokers upon cupboards, chest drawers, and other furniture within, and awakening harvesters who were not already astir. But of all ruddy things that morning, the brightest were two broad arms of painted wood, which rose from the margin of a yellow cornfield hard by Marlow village. They, with two others below, formed the revolving Maltese cross of the reaping machine, which had been brought into the field on the previous evening to be ready for operations this day. The paint with which they were smeared, intensified in hue by the sunlight, imparted to them a look of having been dipped in liquid fire. The field had already been opened, that is to say, a lane of a few feet wide had been hand-cut through the wheat along the whole circumference of the field for the passage of the horses and machine. Two groups, one of men and lads, the other of women, had come down the lane just at the hour when the shadows of the eastern hedge-top struck the west hedge midway, so that the heads of the groups were enjoying sunrise while their feet were still in the dawn. They disappeared from the lane between the two stone posts which flanked the nearest field gate. Presently there arose from within a ticking, like the love-making of the grasshopper. The machine had begun, and a moving concatenation was visible. Over the gate, a driver sitting upon one of the hauling horses, an attendant on the seat of the implement. Along one side of the field, the whole wain went, the arms of the mechanical reaper revolving slowly till it passed down the hill quite out of sight. In a minute, it came up on the other side of the field at the same equable pace. The glistening brass star in the forehead of the fore-horse, catching the eye as it rose into view over the stubble, then the bright arms, and then the whole machine. The narrow lane of stubble encompassing the field grew wider with each circuit, and the standing corn was reduced to smaller area as the morning wore on. Rabbits, hares, snakes, rats, consisting of this company of minders, by reason of the charm which is acquired by women when she becomes part and parcel of outdoor nature, and is not merely an object set down therein as at ordinary times. A field man is a personality afield. A field woman is a portion of the field. She has somehow lost her own margin, imbibed the essence of her surrounding, and assimilated herself with it. The women, or rather girls, for they were mostly young, wore drawn cotton bonnets with great flapping curtains to keep off the sun, and gloves to prevent their hands being wounded by the stubble. There was one wearing a pale pink jacket, another in a cream-coloured, tight-sleeved gown, another in a petticoat as red as the arms of the reaping machine, and others, older, in the brown rough roper or overall. The old established and most appropriate dress for the field woman, which the young ones were abandoning. This morning, the eye returns involuntarily to the girl in the pink cotton jacket, she being the most flexuous and finely drawn figure of them all. But her bonnet is pulled so far above her brow that none of her face is disclosed, while she binds, though her complexion may be guessed from a straight line or two of dark brown hair which extends below the curtain of her bonnet. Perhaps one reason why she seduces casual attention is that she never courts it, though the other women often gaze round them. Her binding proceeds with clock-like monotony. From the sheaf last finished she draws a handful of ears, patting their tips with her left palm to bring them even. Then, stooping low, she moves forward, gathering the corn with both hands against her knees, and pushing her left gloved hand under the bundle to meet the right on the other side, holding the corn in an embrace like that of a lover. She brings the ends of the bond together and kneels on the sheaf while she ties it, beating back her skirts now and then when lifted by the breeze. A bit of her naked arm is visible between the buff leather of the gauntlet and the sleeve of her gown, and as the day wears on, its feminine smoothness becomes scarified by the stubble and bleeds. At intervals she stands up to rest and to retie her disarranged right apron, or to pull her bonnet straight. Then one can see the oval face of a handsome young woman with deep dark eyes and long heavy clinging tresses which seem to clasp in a beseeching way anything they fall against. The cheeks are paler, the teeth more regular, the red lips thinner than is usual in a country-bred girl. It is Tess d'Urberville, otherwise d'Urberville, somewhat changed, the same, but not the same, at the present stage of her existence, living as a stranger and an alien here, though it was no strange land that she was in. After a long seclusion, she had come to resolve, during the week under notice, to undertake outdoor work in her native village, the busiest season of the year in the agricultural world having arrived, and nothing that she could do within the house being so remunerative for the time as harvesting in the fields. The movements of the other women were more or less similar to Tess's, the whole bevy of them drawing together like dancers in a quadrille at the completion of a sheaf by each, every one placing her sheaf on end against those of the rest, till a shock, or stitch, as it was here called, of 10 or a dozen was formed. They went to breakfast and came again with the work, and the work proceeded as before. As the hour of 11 drew near, a person watching her might have noticed that Tess's glance flitted wistfully to the brow of the hill sheathing. On the verge of the hour, the heads of a group of children, of ages ranging from 6 to 14, rose above the stubbly convexity of the hill. The face of Tess flushed slightly, but still she did not pause. The eldest of the comers, a girl who wore a triangular shawl, its corner draggling on the stubble, carried in her arms what at first sight seemed to be a doll, but proved to be an infant in long clothes. Another brought some lunch. The harvesters ceased working, took their provisions, and sat down against one of the shocks. Here they fell to, the men plying a stone jar freely and passing around a cup. Tess D'Urberville had been one of the last to suspend her labours. She sat down at the end of the shock, her face turned somewhat away from her companions. When she had deposited herself, a man in a rabbit-skin cap and with a red handkerchief tucked into his belt held the cup of ale over the top of the shock for her to drink, but she did not accept his offer. As soon as her lunch was spread, she called up the big girl, her sister, and took the baby of her, who, glad to be relieved of the burden, went away to the next shock and joined the other children playing there. Tess, with a curiously stealthy yet courageous movement, and with still rising colour, unfastened her frock and began suckling the child. The men who sat nearest considerately turned their faces towards the other end of the field, some of them beginning to smoke, one with absent-minded fondness, regretfully stroking the jar that would no longer yield a stream. All the women but Tess fell into animated talk, and adjusted the disarranged knots of their hair. When the infant had taken its fill, the young mother sat it upright in her lap, and, looking into the far distance, dandled it with a gloomy indifference it was almost dislike. Then, all of a sudden, she fell to violently kissing it some dozens of times, as if she could never leave off, the child crying at the vehemence of an onset, which strangely combined passionateness with contempt. She's fond of that there child, though she mid pretend not to be, and say she wishes the baby and her too were in the churchyard, observed the woman in the red petticoat. She'll soon leave off saying that, replied the one in buff. Lord, 'tis wonderful what a body can get used to in time. 'Twas 1,000 pities that it should have happened to she, of all others. But 'tis always the comeliest. The plain ones be as safe as churches, nay, Jenny. The speaker turned to one of the group, who certainly was not ill to find as plain. It was 1,000 pities indeed. It was impossible for even an enemy to feel otherwise on looking at Tess as she sat there, with her flower-like mouth and large tender eyes, neither black nor blue nor grey nor violet, rather all those shades together, and 100 others which could be seen if one looked into their irises. Shade behind shade, tint beyond tint, round depths that had no bottom, an almost typical woman, but for the slight incautiousness of character inherited from her race. The resolution which had surprised herself had brought her into the fields this week for the first time during many months. After wearing and wasting her palpitating heart with every engine of regret that lonely inexperience could devise, common sense had illuminated her. She felt that she would do well to be useful again, to taste a new sweet independence at any price. The past was past. Whatever it had been, it was no more at hand. Whatever its consequences, time would close over them. They would all, in a few years, be as if they had never been, and she herself grassed down and forgotten. Meanwhile, the trees were just as green as before. The birds sang, and the sun shone, as was sickened because of her pain. She might have seen that what had bowed her head so profoundly, the thought of the world's concern at her situation, was founded on an illusion. She was not an existence, an experience, a passion, a structure of sensations to anybody but herself. To all humankind, besides Tess, was only a passing thought. Even to friends, she was no more than a frequently passing thought. If she made herself miserable the livelong day and night, it was only this much to them. She makes herself unhappy. If she tried to be cheerful, to dismiss all care, to take pleasure in the daylight, the flowers, the baby, she could only be this idea to them. She bears it very well. Alone in a desert island, would she have been wretched at what had happened to her? Not greatly. If she could have been but just created to discover herself as a spouseless mother, with no experience of life, except as the parent of a nameless child, would the position have caused her to despair? No, she would have taken it calmly and found pleasures therein. Most of the misery had been generated by her conventional aspect, and not by her innate sensations. Whatever Tess's reasoning, some spirit had induced her to dress herself up neatly, as she had formerly done, and come out into the fields, harvest hands being greatly in demand just then. This was why she had borne herself with dignity, and had looked people calmly in the face at times, even when holding the baby in her arms. The harvest men rose from the shock of corn, and stretched their limbs, and extinguished their pipes. The horses, which had been unharnessed and fed, were again attached to the scarlet machine. Tess, having quickly eaten her own meal, beckoned her eldest sister to come take away the baby, fastened her dress, put on the buff, gloves again, and stooped anew to draw a bond from the last completed sheaf for the tying of the next. In the afternoon and evening, the proceedings of the morning were continued, Tess staying on till dusk with the body of harvesters. Then they all rode home in one of the largest wagons, in the company of a broad tarnished moon that had risen from the ground to the eastwards, its face resembling an outworn gold-leaf halo of some worm-eaten Tuscan saint. Tess's female companions sang songs, and showed themselves very sympathetic and glad at her reappearance out of doors, though they could not refrain from mischievously throwing in a few verses of the ballad about the maid who went to the merry green wood, and came back a changed person. There are counterpoises and compensations in life, and the event which had made of her a social warning had also, for the moment, made her the most interesting personage in the village to many. Their friendliness won her still farther away from herself. Their lively spirits were contagious, and she became almost gay. But now that her mortal sorrows were passing away, a fresh one arose on the natural side of her, which knew no social law. When she reached home, it was to learn, to her grief, that the baby had been suddenly taken ill since the afternoon. Some such collapse had been probable, so tender and puny was its frame, but the event came as a shock nevertheless. The baby's offence against society in coming into the world was forgotten by the girl mother. Her soul's desire was to continue that offence by preserving the life of the child. However, it soon grew clear that the hour of emancipation for that little prisoner of the flesh was to arrive earlier than her worst misgivings had conjectured. And when she had discovered this, she was plunged into a misery which transcended that of the child's simple laws. Her baby had not been baptized. Tess had drifted into a frame of mind which accepted passively the consideration that, if she should have to burn for what she had done, burn she must, and there village girls. She was well grounded in the Holy Scriptures and had dutifully studied the histories of Aloha and Alaba, and knew the inferences to be drawn therefrom. But when the same question arose with regard to the baby, it had a very different colour. Her darling was about to die, and no salvation. It was nearly bedtime, but she rushed downstairs and asked if she might send for the parson. The moment happened to be one at which her father's sense of the antique nobility of his family was highest, and his sensitiveness to the smudge which Tess had set upon that nobility most pronounced. For he had just returned from his evening booze at Rolliver's Inn. No parson should come inside his door, he declared, prying into his affairs just then, when, by her shame, it had become more necessary than ever to hide them. He locked the door and put the key in his pocket. The household went to bed, and, distressed beyond measure, Tess retired also. She was continually waking as she lay, and, in the middle of the night, found that the baby was still worse. It was obviously dying, quietly and painlessly, but none the less surely. In her misery, she rocked herself upon the bed. The clock struck the solemn hour of 1, that hour when thought stalks outside reason, and malignant possibilities stand rock firm as facts. She thought of the child consigned to the nethermost corner of hell as its double doom for lack of baptism and lack of legitimacy. So the arch-fiend, tossing it with his three-pronged fork, like the one they used for heating the oven on baking days, to which picture she added many other quaint and curious details of torment taught the young in this Christian country. The lurid presentiment so powerfully affected her imagination in the silence of the sleeping house that her nightgown became damp with perspiration, and the bedstead shook with each throb of her heart. The infant's breathing grew more difficult, and the mother's mental tension increased. It was useless to devour the little thing with kisses. She could stay in bed no longer, and walked feverishly about the room. "Oh, merciful God, have pity upon my poor baby," she cried. "Heap as much anger as you want to upon me, and welcome, but pity the child." She leaned against the chest of drawers and murmured incoherent supplications for a long while, till she suddenly started up. Perhaps the baby can be saved. Perhaps it will be just the same." She spoke so brightly that it seemed as though her face might have shone in the gloom surrounding her. She lit a candle and went to a second and a third bed under the wall, where she woke her little sisters and brothers, all of whom occupied the same room. Pulling out the washing stand so that she could get behind it, she poured some water from a jug and made them kneel around, putting their hands together with fingers exactly vertical, while the children, scarcely awake, awe-stricken at her manner, their eyes growing larger and larger, remained in this position. She took the baby from her bed, a child's child, so immature as scarce to seem a sufficient personality to endow its producer with a maternal title. Tess then stood erect with the infant in her arm beside the basin. The next sister held the prayer book open before her, as the clerk at church held it before the parson, and thus the emotional girl set about baptizing her child. Her figure looked singularly tall and imposing as she stood in her long white nightgown, a thick cable of twisted dark hair hanging straight down her back to her waist. The kindly dimness of the weak candle abstracted from her form and features the little blemishes which sunlight might have revealed. The stubble scratches upon her wrists, the wariness of her eyes, her high enthusiasm having a transfiguring effect upon the face which had been her undoing, showing it as a thing of eyes blinking and red, awaited her preparations, full of suspended wonder, which their physical heaviness at that hour would not allow to become active. The eldest of them said, "Be you really going to christen him, Tess?" The girl-mother replied in a grave affirmative. "What's his name going to be?" She had not thought of that, but a name came into her head as she proceeded with the baptismal service, and now she pronounced it. "Sorrow, I baptize thee in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." She sprinkled the water, and there was silence. "Say Amen, children." The tiny voices peeped in obedient response. "Amen." Tess went on. "We received this child, and so forth, and do sign him with the sign of the cross." Here she dipped her hand into the basin, and fervently threw an immense cross upon the baby with her forefinger, continuing with the customary sentences as to his manfully fighting against sin, the world, and the devil, and being a faithful soldier and servant unto his life's end. She duly went on with the Lord's Prayer, the children lisping it after her in a thin, gnat-like wail, till, at the conclusion, raising their voices to clerk's pitch, they again piped into the silence, "Amen." Then their sister, with much augmented confidence in the efficacy of this sacrament, poured forth from the bottom of her heart the thanksgiving that follows, uttering it boldly and triumphantly in the stopped diapason, which her voice acquired when her heart was in her speech, and which will never be forgotten by those who knew her. The ecstasy of faith almost apotheosized her. It set upon her face a glowing irritation, and brought a red spot into the middle of each cheek, while the miniature candle flame inverted in her eye pupils shone like a diamond. The children gazed up at her with more and more reverence, and no longer had a will for questioning. She did not look like Sissy to them now, but as a being, large, towering, and awful, a divine personage with whom they had nothing in common. Poor Sorrow's campaign against sin, the world, and the devil was doomed to be of limited brilliancy. Luckily, perhaps for himself, considering his beginnings. In the blue of the morning, that fragile soldier and servant breathed his last, and when the other children awoke, they cried bitterly, and begged Sissy to have another pretty baby. The calmness which had possessed Tess since the christening remained with her in the infant's loss. In the daylight, indeed, she felt her terrors about his soul to have been somewhat exaggerated. Whether well-founded or not, she had no uneasiness now, reasoning that if Providence would not ratify such an act of approximation, she, for one, did not value the kind of heaven lost by the irregularity, either for herself or for her child. So passed away Sorrow the undesired, the intrusive creature, the bastard gift of shameless nature, who respects not the civil law. A waif to whom eternal time had been a matter of days merely, whom knew not that such things as years and centuries ever were, to whom the cottage interior was the universe, the week's weather climate, newborn babyhood human existence, and the instinct to suck human knowledge. Tess, who mused on the christening a good deal, wondered if it was doctrinally sufficient to secure a Christian burial for the child. Nobody could tell this but the parson of the parish, and he was a newcomer and a very reserved man. She went to his house after dusk and stood by the gate, but could not summon courage to go in. The enterprise would have been abandoned if she had not, by accident, met him coming homeward as she turned away. sir. He expressed his willingness to listen, and she told the story of the baby's illness and the extemporized ordinance. And now, sir, she added earnestly, can you tell me this? Will it be just the same for him as if you had baptized him? Having the natural feelings of a tradesman at finding that a job he should have been called in for had been unskilfully botched by his customers among themselves, he was disposed to say no. Yet the dignity of the girl, the strange tenderness in her voice, combined to affect his nobler impulses, or rather those that he had left in him after 10 years of endeavour to craft technical belief on actual skepticism. The man and the ecclesiastic fought within him, and the victory fell to the man. My dear girl, he said, it will be just the same. Then you will give him a Christian burial? She asked quickly. The vicar felt himself cornered. Hearing of the baby's illness, he had conscientiously come to the house after nightfall to perform the rite, and, unaware that the refusal to admit him had come from Tess's father, and not from Tess, he could not allow the plea of the necessity. Ah, that's another matter, he said. Another matter? Why? Asked Tess, rather warmly. Well, I would willingly do so, if only we two were concerned. But I must not, for liturgical reasons. Just for once, sir. Really, I must not. Oh, sir, for pity's sake. She seized his hand as she spoke. He withdrew it, shaking his head. Then I do not like you, she burst out, and I'll never come to your church no more. Don't talk so rashly, Tess. Perhaps it will be just the same to him if you don't. Will it be just the same? Don't, for God's sake, speak as a saint sinner, but as you yourself to me, myself, poor me. How the vicar reconciled his answer with the strict notions he supposed himself to hold on these subjects, it is beyond a layman's power to tell, though not to excuse. Somewhat moved, he said in this case also, it will be just the same. So, the baby was carried in a small deal box under an ancient woman's shawl to the churchyard that night, and buried by lantern light, at the cost of a shilling and a pint of beer to the sexton, in that shabby corner of God's allotment where he lets the nettles grow, and where all unbaptized infants, notorious drunkards, suicides, and others of the conjecturally damned are laid. In spite of the untoward surroundings, however, Tess bravely made a little cross of 2 laths and a piece of string, and, having bound it with flowers, she stuck it up at the head of the grave one evening, where she could enter the churchyard without being seen, putting at the foot also a bunch of the same flowers in a little jar of water to keep them alive. What matter was it that, on the outside of the jar, the eye of mere observation noted the words, Keelwell's marmalade? The eye of maternal affection did not see them in its vision of higher things. Chapter 15. By experience, says Roger Ascham, we find out a short way by long wandering. Not seldom that long wandering unfits us for farther travel, and of what use is our experience to us then? Tess D'Urberville's experience was of this incapacitating kind. At last she had learned what to do, but who would now accept her doing? If before going to the D'Urbervilles she had rigorously moved under the guidance of sundry gnomic texts and phrases known to her and to the world in general, no doubt she would never Saint Augustine, thou hast counselled a better course than thou hast permitted. She remained in her father's house during the winter months, plucking fowls, or cramming turkeys and geese, or making clothes for her sisters and brothers out of some finery which d'Urberville had given her, and she had put by with contempt. Apply to him she would not, but she would often clasp her hands behind her head and muse when she was supposed to be working hard. She philosophically noted dates as they came past in the revolution of the year. The disastrous night of her life at Tentridge, with its dark background of the chase. Also, the dates of the baby's birth and death. Also, her own birthday, and every other day, individualized by incidences in which she had taken some share. She suddenly thought, one afternoon, when looking in the glass at her fairness, that there was yet another date of greater importance to her than those, that of her own death, when all these charms would have disappeared. A day which lay sly and unseen among all the other days of the year, giving no sign or sound when she annually passed over it, but nonetheless surely there. When was it? Why did she not feel the chill of each yearly encounter with such a cold relation? She had Jeremy Taylor's thought that sometime in the future those who had known her would say, "It is the day that poor Tess D'Urberville died," and there would be nothing singular to their minds in the statement of that day, doomed to be her terminus in time through all the ages. She did not know the place in month, week, season, or year. Almost at a leap, Tess thus changed from simple girl to complex woman. Symbols of reflectiveness passed into her face, and a note of tragedy at times into her voice. Her eyes grew larger and more eloquent. She became what would have been called a fine creature. Her aspect was fair and arresting, her soul that of a woman whom the turbulent experiences of the last year or two had quite failed to demoralize. But, for the world's opinion, those experiences would have been simply a liberal education. She had held so aloof of late that her trouble, never generally known, was nearly forgotten in Marlowe. But it became evident to her that she could never be really comfortable again in a place which had seen the collapse of her family's attempt to claim kin, and, through her, even closer union with the rich d'Urbervilles. At least she could not be comfortable there till long years should have obliterated her keen consciousness of it. Yet, even now, Tess felt the pulse of hopeful life still warm within her. She might be happy in some nook which had no memories. To escape the past and all that appertained thereto was to annihilate it, and to do that she would have to get away. Was once lost, always lost, really true of chastity? She would ask herself. She might prove it false if she could veil bygones. The recuperative power which pervaded organic nature was surely not denied to maidenhood alone. She waited a long time without finding opportunity for a new departure. A particularly fine spring came round, and the stir of germination was almost audible in the buds. It moved her as it moved the wild animals, and made her passionate to go. At last, one day in early May, a letter reached her from an old friend of her mother's, to whom she had addressed inquiries long before. A dairyman she had never seen. That that a skillful milkmaid was required at this dairy house, and that he would be glad to have her for the summer months, if she had found nothing to do in the interim. It was not quite so far off as she could have wished, but it was probably far enough, her radius of movement and repute having been so small. To persons of limited spheres, miles are as geographical degrees, parishes as counties, counties as provinces and kingdoms. On one point she was resolved. There should be no more d'Urberville air castles in the dreams and deeds of her new life. She would be the dairymaid Tess, and nothing more. Her mother knew Tess's feeling on this point so well, though no words had passed between them on the subject, that she never alluded to the knightly ancestry now. Yet, such is human inconsistency that one of the interests of the new place, to her, was the accidental virtue of its lying near her forefathers' country, for they were not Blackmore men, though her mother was Blackmore to the bone. The dairy called Talbothays, for which she was bound, stood not remotely from one of the former estates of the d'Urbervilles, near the great family vaults of her grandames and their powerful husbands. She would be able to look at them and think only that d'Urberville, like Babylon, had fallen, but that the individual innocence of a humble descendant could lapse as silently. All the while she wondered if any strange, good thing might come of her being in her ancestral land, and some spirit within her rose automatically as the sap in the twigs. It was unexpended youth, surging up anew after its temporary check, and bringing with it hope and the invincible instinct towards self.